And it's been bad. So just kind of your overall feeling on that.
Well, actually, I am just devastated with the loss of community members which started in July with this huge increase in gun violence. It has just been heartbreaking to see so many community members lose their lives at the hands of gun violence. And as someone who actually has spent a lot of time consoling moms and grandmoms who've lost their kids to gun violence, I feel this very deeply. And I think what we traditionally do, our knee jerk reaction is we need more police, right? But we had police for a lot of years with the gang enforcement unit, and they consistently, over 50% of their stops were of African Americans in a city with a 6% African American population. So as I arrived at City Council, the Police Bureau chose to change the name of the Gang Enforcement Unit to the Gun Violence Reduction Team. But I can tell you that the history, and with no new training, with no new focus, but basically taking the same officers and just kind of changing the name of the specialty unit that they were a part of. As you may remember, it was July 1st that the city reduced the police bureau's budget by $15 million, which went into effect on July 1st. In mid-July, we got the first written report about the significant rise in gun violence and here in Portland, and it followed a trend all across the country. And what we know is that historically, in economic downturns and economic devastation, the level of crimes go way up. I know that 911 has their calls for domestic violence have increased over 150%. And we don't know what the impact has been on child abuse because the people who interact with children and are required to report aren't interacting with children, right? But if we look at the numbers across the board about the increase in violence, I would assume that child abuse is up as well, right? So
What's it like to console a victim's family member?
for me, I am always, I want to know what the family wants, right? Because most of the time when a family has experienced violence, whether it's the hands of a community member or the hands of a police officer, the family that is impacted are just so devastated, they just don't know how to put one foot in front of the other. And so my role is always to listen and to seek where they want support, right? It's not about me. It's not about, actually doing anything that I think is the right thing to do. It's really about listening to the family. Sometimes they want to talk to a lawyer, right? And I will connect them to lawyers that I know in the community that will take cases like that. Sometimes they want to talk about what the family needs right now for support, and I try to help them connect to community services for what they need right now. I can tell you in some cases, it takes family members a lot of years before they can really articulate what their needs are. And I think of Kendra James' mom when I say that because it took her 10 years to be able to talk about her daughter's death outside of her own family, right? So each family is a bit different, and my role, even before I got to City Hall, was what does the family need? How can I support the family getting their needs met?
So let's talk some more about GVRT because at, at this point, that decision has become controversial. I think it was probably controversial when it happened, and it's
Uh,
even more controversial.
you may remember I actually put in those cuts twice before and could not get two additional votes to cut those units. So I actually I don't know why it would be controversial since the data came out like 2 weeks after the cut was actually official. New budget processes prior to the one when I finally was able to get those 3 units cut. And it
Right.
was the gun violence reduction team that used to be the gang enforcement unit. It was the school resource officers, and it was the transit police. Each of those three specialty programs overwhelmingly impact African American people in our community. Each one of those programs had overrepresentation of African Americans that had been stopped, questioned, and searched. And if there was a penalty, the penalty was harsher for those individuals, right? And so, in my mind, when I first got to City Hall, those three programs were on my list to cut because of their racially disparate outcomes. It wasn't until the summer, when tens of thousands of people took to the street, that my other colleagues actually started having interest in what could change within the Portland Police Bureau. And I was able to make the case that these programs have a history of racially discriminatory impacts, and therefore those should be the first things on the cutting block, right? And I was able to get my colleagues to support that, and that's why the $15 million was cut.
So what do you do about curbing this gun violence? Because I mean, go ahead.
I think that's an excellent question. What do we do to curb it? First, we have to figure out why the gun violence is happening, right? And as I mentioned, what percentage of it is related to domestic violence? I know several of the people who died, I know it was directly related to domestic violence. How are we supporting people coming back from incarceration, right? When I was a state legislator, we gave inmates who were leaving state institutions $25 in a bus ticket. And we said, get housing, report to your parole or probation officer. If you need alcohol and drug treatment, go get it and pay for it, right? Oh, and by the way, you need to find housing, you need to find a job, right? And we gave people $25 and a bus ticket and expected miracles, right? We're talking now within the city council as well as at the county. If we gave people who are returning from state incarceration a monthly income of say $1,500, $1,600 for 6 months to get them an ability to stabilize themselves, maybe when they came back, they would have actually an opportunity to figure out how do I get in a job training program? How do I find permanent housing? How do I get the other needs that I have met? Because we have no analysis of the gun violence, right? We today can't tell you what is really precipitating this rise in violence other than economic insecurity. We know many people have been without a paycheck since March, and people are desperate, right? And when they don't see a vision of where we're moving or where they can get help, I think people get desperate, right? But honestly, we don't have enough analysis to know what is actually why, the reasoning behind. We can make some assumptions, and some of the assumptions that we make, what I don't want us to do is make an assumption that leads us back to a failed program, right? If the gang enforcement team had worked, we'd have no gangs in the city of Portland. For 14 years, we stopped primarily Black men, and in fact had no impact at all on gang violence. The same is also true when the gun violence team was created, and honestly, it was created, I think personally, because of me, because I had been the biggest critic of the gang enforcement unit for the last 14 years. And so the day I showed up at City Hall, all of a sudden we didn't have a gang enforcement unit anymore. Now we had a gun violence reduction team. But I asked, what new training have police had so that they now are focused on gun violence rather than gang enforcement? They had no answer, no response to that, right? So what I think we need to do is have police do the police job, and the police job is to investigate crime, right? Period. That's it. Investigate crime. That's it, right? So we need additional resources.
You don't think there needs to be any like proactive police work, because that's what part of what GVRT was proactively getting that stuff off, getting those guns off out of the hands of felons.
I will respectfully disagree with you. If you look at the data, the annual reporting, there is very few convictions that are tied back to gang activity. If you look at the auditor's reports that came out on the gang enforcement team before they changed it to the gun violence reduction team, the police couldn't even articulate the reasons for the stops. They said they weren't required to record that. They just knew when they saw. But yet 80% of the stops that they made actually did not lead to arrests. They didn't lead to tickets. They didn't lead to any additional action, right? But 36% of the people they stopped are, twice as many people that they stopped. Let me back up. African Americans were twice as likely to be asked for consent searches, right? In fact, 36% of the searches of African Americans, they asked for consent searches and did not find, and found almost nothing. Again, 80% of those stops So think about what it feels like to be in a community and you're African American and you are headed to school or you're in your neighborhood headed to a friend's house and you get stopped constantly, constantly asked to be searched, constantly asked where you're going, why are you on the street. No one should have to live like that in our community, and no one should. So what the gang enforcement team and the gun violence reduction team may have had some success, but they've not been able to show it to me.
I want to go back to where you talked about your idea when you were in the legislature about providing money for folks getting out of prison. So do you believe that would prevent them from going back into a life of crime if they had that support system?
Yes, I think if people had an opportunity, there's a program, if you want to confirm this information, called at Central City Concern, and it's called Flip the Script,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Okay.
And they work with returning ex-felons, and the stories that you hear from them would break your heart. So if you committed a crime, you went, you did your time, and you come back, you can't find housing, you can't find employment. There's a whole lot of barriers to people fully reintegrating back into our community. And so I suspect that that's why the recidivism rate is so high in the state of Oregon, is because when people come back and they can't connect, most of the time when people go to prison, they ruin a lot of personal relationships, right? So we don't give the people anything to help them kind of center themselves when they come back, right? And I think that's a big problem. And that may be, and I'm not saying it is, but I think that may be part of the rise in gun violence. I know that Black people aren't manufacturing guns and they don't sell guns. So, how they get into the community at such a high rate is something for some other analysis, right? But what I do know is that if people don't have hope, the potential for them to participate in violent activity is risen, right? I'm also working with the Office of Violence Prevention and Community Justice,
Mm-hmm.
uh, because I believe that there has to be, the police cannot solve this issue on their own. There has to be community response. And part of my work with these two organizations is to learn more about the role that the Office of Violence Prevention plays in actually supporting community members who are experiencing violence in their community, and a role that community justice plays with their outreach workers and their parole and probation officers, right? So it's my belief if we look at what the county offers and what the city offers and figure out, is there duplication, and are there ways to actually complement each other's work? I think what we could do is build a much stronger community outreach team that would have relationships with individuals who may be involved in violent behavior or activity. So I'm investigating that now. I've had Dr. John Jay from Boston University come and speak to the city council at convenings. We will have the third one next month. And the entire Multnomah County Board of County Commissioners have participated. My city council colleagues have participated. Recently, we invited the sheriff and the police chief to be part of these convenings, because what I'm sharing in these convenings from Dr. J is some promising practices that have been tried in other parts of the country. I'm really excited about a program called Violence Interrupters, where we actually pay community members who have trusted relationships with folks in the community to be the de-escalator and to be the mediator for community conflicts, so that they don't rise to the level of A, gang violence, and B, calling 911 to intervene.
What do you say to the people right now?
So what I will tell them is that nothing prevents Portland Police Chief today from sending his police force where he thinks there's the most need. Nothing. You don't need a specialty program for that. I said to Chief Lavelle, why don't you just assign detectives that all they do is investigate gun violence, right? He could do that. He could also change how patrol happens so that he is targeting spots that have seen an increase in gun violence. There's nothing that prevents him from doing that. We have Last time I checked, 1,150 employees in the police bureau, yet he says there are only 396 available for patrol. Why is that? I don't understand their management structure and how they deploy resources. I do know they spend an awful lot of resources at protests. And in my mind, that was a squandering of a lot of public resources that were unnecessary. There have been some times that a police presence would have been appropriate, my point too is what the neighbors should know is that today we could deploy people in areas that we think has had an increase in gun violence, and we could have patrol officers walking the beat today. Why aren't we doing that? And I do not accept the excuse that they don't have enough resources. They have 1,100 employees. I don't know how they staff what they staff, and I keep asking these questions of the police bureau. Have not been satisfied with the answer. So again, today, Chief Lavelle could say that we are going to over patrol a segment of the community because we've identified that that's an area where there's an increase in gun violence. Nothing stops them from doing that. Well, let me just say that we are at the early stages, as you know. Last year, the community demanded transformation in our policing, and we are at the very beginning stages of that, right? And so there are a couple of efforts that the mayor and I are working on that I just want to give you a heads up on. One is a town hall that we're going to have next month for Black boys and men between 14 and 44, because all the data shows that those are the ones most impacted when we are over police in our community, right? So we need to have a direct conversation. The mayor and I are going to co-convene this conversation, this town hall, and we're going to hear directly from 14 to 44-year-old Black people what their experience has been and what they want to see us do in relationship to addressing the rise in gun violence. I'm looking forward to that. I think that's going to be a very stimulating conversation. But I also want to encourage your listeners to actually support putting police where we need them, right? Without specialty units are no magic anything, right? They are simply a way to just put a group of people in one location, right? But there's nothing stopping us from doing that today. So we will have the Black Youth Town Hall. And another thing I'm excited about is helping to develop with the Portland Community Engaged Policing Subcommittee, that's a mouthful, a truth and reconciliation process. We have a lot of work to do to start healing in this community. The police have work that they need to do internally. And I'm so thrilled that Chief Lavelle has agreed that he will participate and have his officers participate in this truth and reconciliation process. We haven't scheduled it yet, so I'm not sure. It'll be part of the budget conversation as we roll it out. But I'm excited about this because the police have work they must do behind closed doors with their members, right? I have watched police officers, the ones who are supposed to be really good at public communication, and they are really bad at it. And so I want them to have time behind closed doors so that they get prepared to actually come out and have real community conversation. The other part is the community needs a process where we can address the generational harm that has injured people based on racist practices and policies. And then we need to talk about how we prioritize what we agreed to commit to over the next year or two, right? We didn't create this racist system in one budget cycle, and we're not going to undo it in one budget cycle, right? So there's a lot going on now to actually organize these public opportunities for engagement. And as you also know, we're about to launch the application for the commission that will be putting together the Community Oversight Board for police accountability, right? So there's a lot of work that's happening, and I don't want us to get distracted by reinstituting measures that consistently have shown that they have racially disparate outcomes and don't do anything, excuse me, to address the issue of whether it's gang violence or gun violence, right? The numbers look exactly the same for who is stopped, who is searched. When the gang enforcement unit went from gang enforcement to gun violence, and guess what? The arrest records are also the exact same. So if 80% of the people they stopped were people that didn't have weapons, why were they stopped? And we don't want to repeat that past mistakes. I think last year was about us coming to a racial reckoning about how we use our power as a government to actually either make people's lives better or to make people's lives worse. And policing, for the most part, has done a lot to actually destroy African American families in Oregon and across the country for that matter.